Hi, I'm Ryan from Amber Elm. I recently made a video that went over the basics of synthesis, more specifically modular synthesis. When I say basic, I mean starting at zero, no need to understand like anything that's going on basic. And this is gonna build on that video. So if you don't really know what's what, like what an oscillator is or the different types of waves, but you wanna get into synthesis, go check out that video here first and come back and check this one out. The goal here isn't to make the most crazy patches or the most inspiring sounds, but just to learn the fundamentals of modular so that you have the understanding of the tools to imagine those awesome, inspiring sounds. This video is going to cover LFOs, sequencers, and quantizers, maybe sample and holds, I'm not sure. Not just what they are, but some different ways to use them. The real cool thing about modular synthesis is once you understand what a module is doing, you can use it however you can imagine. As always, this video is timestamped, so feel free to jump around to whatever section you want. So let's pick up where part one left off. LFOs. An LFO, or low frequency oscillator, is an oscillator that runs at a low frequency. Another way you might refer to it is it's not audio rate. And that just means it's not moving fast enough to create an audible sound. They're some of the most useful and versatile tools in modular. So let's hook it up to an oscilloscope to see what it's doing. Just like a regular oscillator, an LFO has multiple waveforms that you can choose from. Sine waves, triangle waves, saw waves, and square waves. We'll get back to that. So when would you use an LFO? And that answer is long. I guess the easiest way to answer it would be to say anytime you want to modulate something else. Volume, pitch, pan, filter cutoff, and those are just kind of the basic uses. Let's make a patch and go through some of those in VCV Rack. Let's start by making a patch that is just an oscillator going through a filter and into our mixer. We'll add our LFO sine wave out to the input of the cutoff CV of our filter. Actually, let's send it first to the oscilloscope so we can see what it's doing. So we'll go out of the LFO into the in of our oscilloscope, the out of the oscilloscope, into the cutoff CV of the filter. You can see the sine wave on the scope and it's opening and closing the filter. If we lower the frequency of the sine wave of the LFO, the cutoff will change slower. If we speed up the frequency, the change happens faster. If we change the type of wave on the LFO, the effect would change. So let's change it to a square wave. Now instead of gradually sort of opening up the filter, it jumps open and closed. Let's change it up and use the LFO to control the volume of a patch. Let's start with a basic synth voice. But let's use our LFO out to the CV input of our mixer. I'm going through the oscilloscope again just to demonstrate. You don't need to use an oscilloscope to make this all work, but I just think it really helps to visualize sort of what it's doing while it's happening. As we play it, the volume is being modulated by the settings of the LFO. If we wanted to change it up again, we could really quickly just take it out of the input for volume and move it to the pan CV input. Now our LFO is modulating the pan of the signal. And you can also use an LFO to modulate an LFO. Set up one LFO to modulate the frequency of another, or the pulse width of a square wave. That looks like this on the oscilloscope. All of this just makes more interesting waveforms and in turn, more interesting modulations. Sequencers and quantizers. Sequencers always threw me for a loop when I was first learning about all of this, and that's because I was thinking about them all wrong. I would start to think of them as modules that spit out notes. They don't. They spit out voltages. in a sequence, and that's it. They need something like an oscillator to receive those voltages and make them useful in one way or another. There are two basic types of sequencers: gate sequencers and trigger sequencers. A gate sequencer sends signals that stay on for a certain duration, high voltage for a set length of time, which is useful for controlling things like note length or sustained events. A trigger sequencer, on the other hand, sends very short pulses, instantaneous high voltage, used to trigger things like drum hits or short envelopes without holding them. Basically, gates control both the timing and the length of events, while triggers simply start them. So let's start with gate sequencers. Gate sequencers will have a lot of ins and outs in common. It's important to understand them, so when you see a different module, you can just sort of apply the principle instead of just memorizing how to hook it up once on one module and what cable goes where. For ins, you'll usually have a clock input, a reset input, and steps input. The clock input is where you send your clock output, and this will set the speed of the sequencer. I'm realizing now that I never really went over in the first video or in this video what a clock is. Luckily, it's not that difficult of a concept to understand. A clock is basically just like a pulse or a heartbeat that keeps everything in time. It sends regular repeating signals to other modules, telling them when to do something, like start a sound or move to the next step in a sequence. You can imagine it sort of like a metronome. The clock helps your whole system stay synchronized, so different parts play or change at the right moments, creating patterns or rhythms that can work together. Some sequencers have a clock built in, but even when they do, they'll usually have a way to use an external clock. The reset input will just restart the sequence anytime a signal is sent to it. If you had an 8-step sequencer, you could use it to lengthen the sequence by having it trigger every 12 steps. Your sequence would play through, then repeat, but only halfway before restarting, giving you a total length of 12 steps. The steps input will change the number of steps in the sequence. If you have an 8-step sequencer, you can change the amount of steps that runs through with the steps input. That can be nice if you're trying to vary your sequence or make it a bit more unpredictable. For this patch, I'm using 2 LFOs, kind of like we talked about before, to modulate the steps input of my sequencer. I'm taking a sine wave out of my first LFO into the steps input of the sequencer, and I'm using the second LFO to modulate the frequency of the first LFO, giving me variation of how the steps change in the sequencer. I know it's a little complicated, and you can mess with it a bunch, but I just wanted to show you kind of what's possible. Okay, so let's get back to talking about the ins and outs that you'll find on most sequencers. For the outputs, you'll likely see a main output, which outputs the sequence, a gate or trigger out, which can trigger an envelope. You might also see something labeled EOC, and this stands for end of cycle. This will send a trigger out each time the sequence runs through. You see this more on samplers, but I thought I'd throw it in here just because. The knobs on the sequencer will let you change the voltage that is being sent out for that specific step. And like I said before, these aren't notes, they're voltages. Here what I have set up is a sequencer running a 4-step sequence. So it's just going through steps 1, 2, 3, and 4 and repeating. Hooked up, the CV out, the main out, is going into my oscilloscope so you can see the voltages that it's sending out. These are all on the same step, so as I turn one knob, you'll see the first step voltage change. Let's turn the second knob, and you can see those voltages changing. Like I said before, the sequencer has a huge range, so little tweaks go a really long way, and you can kind of see that if I turn this knob all the way up and this knob all the way down, you'll see the difference between the voltages. And we're not hearing any sound because I don't have the output going to an oscillator or to the mixer. So we're just seeing the voltages represented on the oscilloscope. Sequencers can be used for things other than sequencing notes, but if you want your sequencer to sequence a melodic pattern or bass line, you'll most likely want to add a quantizer. A quantizer is a super handy little module that takes an incoming voltage and moves it to the closest pitch in a set scale. It's like auto-tune for voltages. So the sequencer is spitting out voltages. You send them through the main out into the volt per octave input of the quantizer, and the volt per octave out of the quantizer into the volt per octave in of your oscillator. Now you can make a much more pleasing melodic sequence. And before moving on from sequencers, I want to mention scale. It will be on some sequencers, and it's pretty important control. The sequencer I've been showing you here in VCV Rack goes from -10 volts to +10 volts. And remember what volt per octave means. That means that this sequencer has a huge range. It will go from inaudibly low to inaudibly high, and small turns of the knob will make big changes. If this module had a scale control, I could scale back that voltage range and turn it into like a 2 volts and have the sequencer knob only work in a 2 octave range, or 1 and only have it span 1 octave. And not every sequencer has them, and the ones like this that don't just need to be used knowing the voltage spread. I'm sure there is a more right way of saying that. Hopefully you get what I mean. So for this example, I have a sequencer from Music Thing Modular. It's a Turing machine. That's for another video. But what I wanted to show you is the scale is set all the way up, and you can see the voltage spread on this from all the way up to +10 to -10. It's a really big spread, and that would be sort of really low to really piercingly high. If we take the scale and just go back to 0.2, this is going to give us around a 2 octave range. And see on the oscilloscope how the voltages get way tamed down. If I wanted to go even further to 0.1, get a 1 octave range, it's going to tame those down even more. And some modules, like this sequencer from Bogue Audio, won't have a scale setting on the module, but if you right click the modules in VCV, some other options can appear. In this case, it's range, which is the same thing as scale. Right now it's selected a ±10 volts, which is again huge, but you can kind of select a range that is more palatable. So 0 to 10 volts, 0 to 5 volts, ±3, ±2, and those will give you your 1 octave, 2 octave ranges. In another video, I'll go over attenuators, which you can use sort of like a dimmer switch for voltages. I thought I might get to sample and hold today, but I think this video is long enough. So next time I will talk about sample and hold and attenuators and probably mults. And I just realized I didn't really get into trigger sequencers. I may save that for another video, but really quickly, a trigger sequencer just sends out a pulse, a voltage that is high and then off. They're really good sequencers for sequencing drum patterns or percussion sounds or triggering other things in a patch. Let me know in the comments if you have any questions about what I went over today. I really try to answer every single comment that comes in, so feel free to ask away. I hope this was helpful. Like I said in the first video, I'm just trying to make a guide that I sort of wish that I had when I was starting out. So try this stuff out, make something cool. I'd love to hear what you come up with. But until then, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.